there's a tremendous amount of misinformation out about inflation, and no one can really seem to explain why it's not going away. We're being told that it has to do with the supply chains, uh, and we're told that there's so much demand coming from people who are finally coming out of their houses after the lockdowns from the pandemic. But there's actually deeper reasons, and it has to do with the quantity theory of money. And I'm have a small presentation that I'd like to show you that help you understand this whole approach and help you understand that inflation isn't going away anytime soon. This is the quantity theory of money equation. It just says that money supply, M2, times the velocity of money equals the GDP. Now, this has to hold because the velocity of money is actually calculated by dividing GDP by the money supply. So it's actually somewhat of a tautology. It has to be true. But it's very useful in explaining what's going on in helping us picture this whole inflationary process. We can further break down GDP. You can see here the blue arrow goes to this line into the production of goods and services times prices, right? Goods and services basically depend on manpower, people, and machinery. So if the economy is slack, meaning you don't have full employment, there's 6% unemployment, there's people you can hire, and you're not running at full capacity, your machinery is not running 24 hours a day, it's fairly easy to increase production and increase supply in that situation. But if you're in the current environment where the unemployment is very low, the labor market is very tight, then you have to depend almost completely on this machinery and increasing the production for the machinery, reducing costs in order to increase production. And so you can hire more workers, you can add machinery, or you can make the production process more efficient. And that's actually what we saw in the last 20 years with the advent of the internet and the increased productivity that the internet brought and the increased digitization of our economy. We had tremendous gains in employment, in productivity, and as a result, we were able to spend a fair amount of money, and inflation didn't bother us. And you can see now this is capacity utilization. Right now on the far right part of the graph, you can see that we're not fully back to a level of capacity utilization that would normally concern us. And I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of economists don't believe that inflation should be a problem, and the reason why a lot of economists missed this burst of inflation. But you can see this is back in the 1970s that capacity utilization was very high, and then in the 1980s this deepest trough on the left-hand side where it almost touched 70% capacity utilization is when Paul Volcker came in and put the brakes on the economy. But the main issue is that our employment situation is so tight that it's actually really constraining our ability to produce goods and services. And that's because we're printing so much money that there's a lot of demand. So the demand side of that equation, the quantity theory of money, is really putting a lot of pressure on the economy. And you can see that in this graph. The yellow line is money supply, the orange line is GDP, and they're tracking pretty strongly. And the blue line is velocity. Now, another reason, in addition to the increases in productivity because of the digital revolution, the internet, and the increases in storing data, retrieving data, and the information available to business managers, is also the people's behavior with regard to money changed. And that's why the velocity was steadily dropping from about 2005 until about 2018 or 2019, when it kind of leveled off. Then when the pandemic hit, it dropped off a cliff and went down to 1. And I don't think it's going to go below 1. That would be very difficult. And I don't see how it would do it. I mean, there'd be more money in the system than GDP, so there's excess money to be spent. It doesn't make sense. But this is how the quantitative theory of money calculation works. We have, June 2020, when money supply was at 15.5 trillion. These are trillions. I guess they're billions, but it's 15.5 billion, which is basically 15 trillion. And that produced a GDP of 21.48 trillion. And during this time, over the next year, money supply increased by 12%. The velocity of money dropped off that cliff that we saw, and the resulting GDP was 22 trillion, up just slightly. So that worked out to be real GDP of 0.5% growth, and the growth from prices was 2%, relatively modest. But as you could see from that graph, the previous graph, the government has continued to finance its spending using printing presses rather than developing a realistic taxing policy and some discipline in their spending. And as a result, money supply has continued to increase on a year-over-year basis at around 12%. There was no change in the velocity of money. And as a result, the current GDP is 24.4 trillion roughly, which is up 10% year over year. So when you have a tight economy, you can't really increase production that much. And you're seeing the resulting, problems with the supply chain. That means that prices have to go up 7%. And what's inflation been based on the most recent releases? It's been 9%. I think there was a release at the beginning of this year, 6.4%. So you can see that this problem of printing money to finance the government spending is a big problem. And the arbitrage is going to continue. I think that the inflation is going to stay at 8%, 9%. I think it's going to take a little bit longer for people to understand that it's not coming down. And as a result, most people can get loans now at 5 or 6%, 7% even. It makes sense to borrow the money, especially if you can get, a shorter term loan or a loan that you can refinance. You're paying 7%, but you're paying back the loan and the principal with dollars that are 8%, 9% cheaper. You're basically printing money. And that's how actually the wealthiest people in the world in the 1920s, that's how they realized their wealth was borrowing money and buying hard assets. And I think that the government isn't completely telling us the truth. I think the 1.4% decline in the GDP was a diversion. I think the government was willing to accept a 1.4% decline in the GDP over announcing, much stronger inflation. And in the next videos, I'm going to be talking about further about, some of this gaslighting that's going on from the Biden administration as far as what are the sources of inflation. And then I'm going to be talking about what you can do as a company to actually handle inflation and manage it and make it your friend. So stay tuned. If you like this video, subscribe to my channel, and I'll keep trying to provide the truth.